I was born into a family that really was a wonderful family. I thought my father's family was still in Europe, so I never really got to know my dad's family personally until later on in my years. But my mother's family was the center of our life. Uh, my mother's parents, lived in Del Rey on the southwest side of the city, and it was an industrial area. They lived in a little home right next to St. John Cantius Church. So my mother had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. My mother's youngest sister, Julia, entered the Felician convent when she was 16 years old, many, many years before my time. And she was always a precious person in the family. But going to family reunions, Christmas Eve was always a special time. But just my grandmother's whole life, too, they had one of these parlors in their home, you know, the kind that nobody goes into except that's where you meet God. And she had a picture of the journey of Jesus with the disciples to Emmaus in one of the photos. And so I always remember when I made my first communion, I got to go in there with her and say a prayer, and she gave me a rosary, and just delightful people. They always had signs of the Lord in their home and in their conversation. Family was the most important thing for them. And my parents, my mother and dad, we lived in River Rouge, Michigan, which was close enough to walk since we had no car. And those were always just great times visiting. As time went along, my parents had a sister besides me. My sister's name was Stasia, who died at the age of about 10 and a half years old when I was about 5 or 6. And that was a very traumatic time in our family. I always remember in our own home we had a picture of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, and that was on the wall in our living room. And in those days when my sister died, she died of, they said blood poisoning, but I don't know what it really was. It could have been a form of leukemia. My parents would be taking her to the hospital all the time and leaving me at my godmother's next door when those times came. But that was a very important time, because when my sister died, then her body was laid out in the home. And it was right under that picture of Jesus weeping over the city of Jerusalem, and really touched my parents very much. I remember my dad always wore a black tie from that time on, and he'd walk to the cemetery, Holy Cross Cemetery in Detroit. He'd walk there from our home in River Rouge. But their faith never seemed to wane, and they sent me to Our Lady of Lourdes School, and I went there for 12 years and was encouraged and taught by the Immaculate Heart of Mary sisters during that time. Very wonderful teachers. And after graduation, I had thought, well, what am I going to do with my life? And I had, as a child, even thought about being a chaplain, because for some reason the Army was important to me growing up. And I had thought about being a chaplain, and maybe there was a little hint of a calling at that time. But as time went along, I still didn't know what I wanted to do because of my battle in high school with Latin. I only took 2 years of it, and I thought, gosh, I don't know how I could be a priest if I had to know Latin, because I heard these priests at Mass, and they always seemed to know what they were doing and saying, and that seemed like an overwhelming project. So when I graduated, I went to work in a toy factory, believe it or not, in Wyandotte, Michigan, all metal products. And then helped my dad build a barn on a piece of land that my parents had bought and out south of Flat Rock. And then I went to work for the Detroit Edison Company. And it was when I was unemployed between the building of the barn and the Edison Company that my dad and I sat down in our living room, and I said to him, maybe I should be like a brother or something, because I didn't think they had to talk Latin. And my dad said at that time, he said, you don't make a decision like that when you're laid off. You make a decision like that when you're working. And so I went to work, and then the Korean War started, and I was drafted. I like to say my prayer was answered because I really wanted to go away and try the military, and my mother prayed that I wouldn't go, and so the war was in Korea, and I got sent to France in a non-combat kind of assignment. I was in the quartermaster. People don't always know that in the military there are a lot of different things to do, like cook and clean clothes and all those kind of things for the men and women now. That was such a wonderful experience for me that when I came back from the military, I'd been praying that if I came back feeling the same way, I would try the vocation to the religious life, to the priesthood. And I came back, and I still felt the same way. By then, when I came back, my parents now lived in that home they had built south of Flat Rock, Michigan. My dad had a heart attack, a couple of them, while I was away, and wasn't in the best of health. He was in like a forced retirement from the Detroit Edison Company himself. So I was walking with him out in the fields, and it was May. We were near the grapevines. I always remember that. And I said to him, Tats, I've been thinking about going to the seminary, but I wouldn't want to leave you and Ma alone at home, since I'm an only son. And my dad said to me, he said, don't worry about us. You have your life to lead, and we have our life to lead, and God will take care of things, which was really wonderful. And so I ended up going to see Father Howard Hungerford, who was the pastor at St. Patrick's, and he sent me to Monsignor Fournier, who was the procurator at Sacred Heart, and I went in to see him with a letter from Father Hungerford. And when I met Father Fournier, who was a wonderful man, he says to me, well, after he heard my story and found out that I had graduated from high school in 1947 and was here I am 1953 with only 2 years of beginner's Latin under my belt, he said to me, well, ordinarily we send candidates like you to Kitchener, Ontario, where they have a special Latin program. But as I sat there, I was resigned to do whatever he would say. And then he said, but what we have here is we have a program where we keep students and they go through first college A, and then if they can make it through that, then we put them in second college. Otherwise, they go to first college B. And I think we'll put you in first college A at Sacred Heart. I said, thank you. And then he said, and you'll have Greek too. And I almost fell out of the chair because at that time those were what I thought were the important things. But I went to the seminary that year in 1953, and wonderful faculty members. I remember men like Father Schmazik in Greek, and Father Young and Father Hubble in Latin, and the classes were fine. The year was great, and I went into second college with my classmates and got through the college program, and then got sent to St. John's. But all the time, during that time, it was like a wonderful nourishment in the Word of God. Not only good people and good example, but a regular program of prayer and scripture, and coming to understand and appreciate who God is in our life. And so I was ordained in 1961 by Cardinal Dearden at the cathedral with my classmates. One of the most striking parts of the ceremony is always the prostration on the floor when you're lying there in a humble position before God, getting ready to be called forth for the ordination and then the imposition of hands. But in those days, too, it still wasn't a clear picture for me of what a priest is all about, because of my own short-sightedness, I'd say, and thinking about Latin. And a wonderful celebration, because just before that, my parents, before my ordination, I would come home every year and for the vacations and work on the farm there where we lived. I worked also at other jobs, but my parents had gotten quite ill, and we took my mother into the hospital in 1960 and to U of M, and my dad and I went back home and spent the week. We'd come every day to we'd go every day to visit her at the hospital. But on Saturday morning of that week, July the 16th, I think it's the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, my dad and I went out to pick red raspberries, and my dad collapsed. And so I carried him back into the home. And he said, "Oh, it's just a little indigestion." So I went to get him some water and came back, and then he died right in my hands. Called Father Hungerford, and I thought, about this a long time, because I had always prayed that my parents would never die alone, being an only son. I just had prayed that every night. In fact, I had a little prayer: Jesus, Mary, and Joseph sit on my mother and father's bed, and guardian angels walk around their bed, protect them from all evil and from all harm this night. Well, here's my dad. He died in my arms. I went to the hospital then that Saturday afternoon to tell my mother, who was a patient there. Turned out she would have cancer. And she knew right away something was up when I walked into the room alone, and I had to tell her. My father's funeral, he had some friends who were Polish priests from Europe, from his brother. I never mentioned this, but his brother was a Carmelite priest in Europe. His brother's name was really John, but he went by the name Joseph, Father Joseph, in the community. So one of the priests from that community had come to this country, and he celebrated the Mass for my dad. My mother just came for a brief visit and had to go back to the hospital, where she would have her lung taken out with from cancer. Then the hospital said to me, "Well, you're going to have to take your mother out of here because we've done all we can for her. She has terminal cancer. And so I thought, should I leave the seminary? This is my last year. But I went to see the Felician sisters, who were just so great. And they had opened up St. Mary's Hospital in Livonia about a year before. This was a time before hospice care. So I went to see them, and I said to, I believe it was Sister Columbine, told her the story and wondered if my mother might be a patient there during this time. They said it wouldn't be a long time for her. It'd be terminal, and could the sisters take her as a patient there? It would be pretty close to St. John's, too, for me to visit. And the sisters said, as long as you have a doctor, and there was a doctor at the seminary who took care of us, and he agreed to do the prescriptions for her, and so she went to St. Mary's, where she had just wonderful care. And many of her friends, too, were in the housekeeping area, so they would come in to visit her. And when she died, which would be about October 29th, I believe, the doctor had come in that morning and said she has about 12 hours to live, and so I informed her brothers and sisters, my uncles and aunts, cousins, and they all came. And they were with her, so she never died alone either. She died with her family. I just thought that was like the answer to a prayer. And then spent the last half year getting ready for the priesthood and being ordained, as I mentioned earlier. But the death of my parents was just a gift from God, the way they died and the way they lived. They were very faithful people in the church, too. In fact, they met in the choir, so at St. John Canches. So it was a wonderful foundation. Then after ordination, I was sent to St. Philip Neri on the east side with a wonderful priest named Father Charles Eulenberg, who really loved the liturgy and had a lot of homespun kind of philosophies, but he was really a good man. He had a message which anybody who went through the school knew, because he taught the seniors every day. Of course, he needed the help of the St. Joseph sisters to keep discipline, but he taught them his program of life, which he called Believe, Obey, and Struggle. But he was a good model, and very interested in the Mass, very loving priest. And he was 75. I always think about that when I reached my age, 75. I thought he was ready to hang it up, and he was still going strong. So those were great years there, too, being there with a priest named Father Joe Guillermo at first, and then Father Joe Melton. And the kind of priest Father Eulenberg was, if you remember, there was a program that started up around that time. There was the Corcio program, and one of the priests, I believe it was Father Melton, was very interested in that and talked about it, and so Father Eulenberg went to it. I mean, here he is, 75, going to a Corcio, something entirely new, and then he came back from it and he said to me, "You have to make one of these Corcios." So you know, most men at first, when they hear the word, they try to find a reason for not going. So I was no different than any other man. But then I went, and Father Ray Ellis was the spiritual director, and it was truly a marvelous experience in community. See, that's what was happening at that particular time in history. The Second Vatican Council came along, and all the time I had thought it was so important to know Latin, and then the council came along, and I always like to say that God loved me so much he changed the language for me, which of course he didn't, but it's still a nice thought. And then began to understand a little bit more about what it meant to serve people and what it meant to live in a community of people. And that was a wonderful community at St. Philip's. And then I got the call from Monsignor Canfield's office to go see him. And at first there I thought I called my spiritual director, and I said to him, gosh, I got this call from the seminary. I said, what am I doing going there, you know? Well, the church had sent me to the University of Detroit with 5 of my classmates, and it was doing that, trying to build us up to get us our MAs so that we could be involved in schoolwork if the cardinal needed us for that. And so I had gone to U of D and gotten the master's in guidance and counseling. And so then I got called to the seminary and sat down with Monsignor Canfield, and he said, we'd like to have you come and be spiritual director to the 9th graders. There had to be about 200 of them. Father Baldwin had been that director, and he was moving on. And I thought, well, that isn't bad. That's like being a priest. Because I'll be involved with the students in confessions and mass, and so we said fine. I said fine to that, and he said, you'll have to teach something, and your major is philosophy, and we can't have you do that. So your minors are in Latin and English, so which one would you like to teach? Well, it didn't take me long to decide English. and I ended up going to the seminary for another wonderful experience in my life, especially with what was going on in the Second Vatican Council and Pope John the 23rd, and it was just a wonderful time, and the greatest men and priests who were there. I mean, like Father Bill Cunningham was on that faculty, and Father Tom Villeroy, and they were so helpful to me too. And I had decided when I was going there that I would try to know all the students by name, and so right at the beginning I would have a test on names, mainly so that I would remember them. But also it helped the students too. But they were some of the finest young people that are in the church. Many of them didn't go on to the priesthood. A lot of them did, but many of them didn't. But they've gone on to do other wonderful things in the church and in the world that we live in. So I was there 5 years before I went to Shrine of the Little Flower, and as an associate with Father Hayes, who had been my spiritual director in the seminary. Enjoyed him. That was a huge parish, overwhelming at first, but you know, again, God is always at work, and I got to know the people, and again, some wonderful people that I met there, like one is still my closest friend, Father Ed Prus, who came as a deacon while I was there. That was interesting too, because he came to me because I had taught his brother in the seminary, and his brother had said, if you need a moderator, a mentor, Ed Prus would be a pretty good guy for that. And so he came to see me. Well, I'm an associate at Shrine. I said to him, well, that's not my decision to make, you know, because you'll have to talk with the pastor, Father Hayes, about coming here, because he's the pastor. I just work here with him. And at the same time I was thinking, gosh, I have so much to do here. What am I going to do, hold this guy's hand? But it's the way God works in life. He's always blessing us, and we many times don't recognize his blessings. And it turned out Ed would become a wonderful friend, later on a co-pastor. We would work together, and in my years at Shrine were great. And then after a long time there, I think again, there are so many things that I learned there about building community, not theoretically, just living the life of service to people and seeing the wonders that God can do and where He leads you and how He works. And recognizing, I think one of the important things in life today for a priest is to be able to recognize the gifts of his people, because there are a lot of wonderful people, and this is what's been happening in the church. There are a lot of wonderful people who have their own unique gifts, just as every one of us does, that God gives, not to be a burden, but gives people to use as a blessing, whether it's illness or a particular talent. The same thing is true with priests. We're all given particular experiences and knowledge that is unique to us, that God gives to us to give. In fact, this is what I've thought a little bit about in my vocation, the experience with my sister's death. There are a lot of people that I have met, especially once I moved on in the priesthood and went from the seminary to shrine, and then after that, wherever I've been, where I've seemed to get called when people have a sick child or a child that is dying. And I don't have any more answers. I just have the experience. And it seems like, even when I went down to Brazil, the same thing happened there. I still remember the children that I met who were sick and those who were taken suddenly from their parents. Like the boy my last year in Brazil who died in a mudslide. He was only 9 years old. And I was there to meet his grandmother and mom and dad the next day, and his parents, and we had a funeral service for them. I don't know, it's just like God sort of calls you to do something special with your vocation. So I think that's what the work of a pastor is somehow today, is to help people appreciate and understand their experiences and their talents and use those gifts to bless people. But Shrine was a place where that began to happen for me. And then, after my years at Shrine, there was this wonderful lady, Delphine Flageot, who at morning masses would pray for vocations and for priests and for missionaries. And I would hear that all the time. And it was just such an impressive thing, because St. Therese, of course, the little flower, is the patroness of universal missions, and all kinds of wonderful things were happening in my life, and I ended up going on a sabbatical thanks to Cardinal Shaka to Ireland, where I met Irish missionaries who were so enthusiastic about their work, and so I came back and there's a little bit of the immaturity always happens. I thought, oh man, learning a different language, maybe I could be a missionary out west where they speak English. But Cardinal Shaka said, no, if you ever want to go out to Africa or to South America, well, Detroit had a mission in South America, in Recife, Nossa Senhora de Lourdes, and I mentioned my interest in the missions to Father Bob Singleton, who had been there many years, and he said, why don't you come down and visit on your vacation? So I took my vacation and went there and visited, and came back again overwhelmed by learning a new language, thinking, could I ever do this? The conditions I lived in, I could live in, but the language. So I hesitated again, then the doors opened, and I had an opportunity to go, and Cardinal Sciacca let me go there for a 3-year stay. And again, it's amazing what God can do. You know, I ended up going there and able to even preach in Portuguese, which is hard enough preaching in English sometimes, but in Portuguese. But it was just another example of me that God is always there in our life, and he's always doing wonderful things, you know. And one of my favorite gospels, it's in the Old Testament. They have eyes, but they don't see, and they have ears, but they don't hear, you know. And we look at all these wonderful things God is doing in our lives, and sometimes we don't really quite grasp it, but he's there, and he's at work. And whether it's language or assignments or people that he sends into our life, he's always doing things. I think I see the hand of God more in my life than I ever did before. Just like, having a Polish Pope, I mean, who traveled all over the world. That came during our time, and I mean, my only memory of popes were they lived in Rome, and they sent letters out, but then along came Pope John Paul II, who was born in a little town close to where my dad was born in Poland. He was raised in Włodawice, and my dad's town was Andrzejów, which is very close to it. And that in the course of the Pope's background, he would go, because he became the Archbishop of Krakow, he would go to a monastery run by the Carmelites, where my uncle was the provincial. It's just amazing to me, all these things happening. And my uncle, my dad's brother, who's the Carmelite, I mean, I never thought I would have an opportunity to see him, and yet after I was ordained, at first he came over for a visit to see some Carmelite priest in the Chicago area and stopped to visit me, and he was the spitting image of my dad. I could hardly talk with him. Believe it or not, Latin was part of the words that I would use with him because my Polish was so bad. But I got to know him, and then he went back to Poland and he died. And the amazing thing to me was, and I believe it was 1979, I had an opportunity to go to Poland, and I did go, and I met my dad's other brother, Matthew, and I went to the church where my dad was baptized and celebrated Mass there, concelebrated Mass there. And one of the things that I remember was I said to a Carmelite priest, I called their community and asked if I might be able to go to the cemetery where my uncle was buried. And at first, because my Polish was so terrible, he thought I wanted to see my uncle. And I said, no, I know he has died, but I'd like to go to his grave. And he said, well, this is a big cemetery, and you probably wouldn't find it by yourself, so we'll have a priest meet you in the square in front of the cathedral in Krakow, and he'll take you. And so Father Belzak was with me on that trip, and a couple of wonderful men from Jackson, Michigan were with me. John and Sylvester were on that trip, and so we went to the cemetery to see my uncle's grave. And when we got to the grave, it was like a little mausoleum. But the interesting thing for me was, when I looked at it, the priest said, this is where he's buried, and it said, Jan Prus. And I always knew my uncle as Joseph. And that was his religious order name, he said, but his real name was John. And then I looked on the stone, because my middle name is John, I looked at the stone and it said Urodził się, which means he was born May 15th, 1900. And my birthday is May 15th, 1929. And what an exciting discovery that was in my life. I knew my dad loved my brother, his brother I should say, loved my uncle, and that my middle name would be his middle name, his name rather I should say. So I was named after him even though my second name was John. And we were born on the same day. These things just amaze me in my life, what you keep discovering about yourself as you go along the journey of God's blessings, how God ties things together, how he takes care of us, how many bonds he creates for us. It was a great time. Going back then, my time in Brazil was another wonderful time. I remember one time there when I was there, I wasn't as sharp in Portuguese, but a girl came up and met me on the street and said she wanted to get married. I knew her mom and dad, I knew her, she was a teacher, and she was maybe about 21 years old. She was a teacher in a little Catholic school called the Visitation. And so I said, well, that'd be fine. Maybe you and your fiance, who are you going to marry? And she mentioned the name of this young man who was Italian, who she had met through her brother who had lived in Italy. So they came to see me, and they began to tell me what they wanted to do, how they wanted to get married, and then go over to Italy where she would make her home. And I thought, gosh, I know that Brazilians are very close to their families, and I said to her, well, I think it's wonderful that you want to get married and go over there, but supposing you don't like it over in Italy after you get there because you're far away from your family, it would seem like maybe a better thing would be for you both to go over to Italy first and see what it's like before you make this commitment to live together for life and find yourself in a country or with a family that you maybe find difficult. Well, they went away, and I didn't see them. And I thought, oh man, I've goofed up this possible marriage. Here's this girl born in this particular area with not too much, and maybe I've shut off her opportunity to leave and to go on to better things. Well, after about 6 months or so, I met her mother, and she said, no, they went over to Italy to see what it was like. And I was so happy. But then, a little while later, her mother said, well, they're going to get married in Italy. And I'm thinking, oh man, now her mom and dad can't go to the wedding. And so I talked with a priest I was with, a wonderful man from Saginaw Diocese, because we were both working with Father Bob Singelin. His name is Harry Sikorsky. And Harry and I tried to figure out a way. I wonder if they would go, if we could get them the money to make the trip, if they could go to their daughter's wedding. And so I asked them, and of course they had no passport, nothing, but they would be thrilled if they could go. And so we found the money and we sent them to Italy, where they stayed for 6 months and had a marvelous, fantastic time. I mean, her father, Jose, learned more about selling of vegetables and fruit because that was his business, and her mom saw the beauty in the flowers and how attractive the earth really is when you have a nice garden. And they both came back and they were so filled with life. And the mom had all of a sudden had a rock garden planted beside her home. And the dad, of course, his son-in-law, gave him the money to get his own little permanent stand. He used to have to get a stand just on the weekends and sell his vegetables. And now his son-in-law found the money to send him to start his own little business. And you know, that whole experience, by the way, in the end, the son-in-law and the daughter moved back to Brazil after they had their first baby, and everybody's happy. But sometimes you start off trying to do something and you wonder, is this thing going to work? Did I just goof up? And God is always saying, just give me what you have. Don't worry about things. I'll take care of things. So those kind of experiences are priceless in my memory. I mean, baptisms, meeting and working with people, and I had thought, you know, by the time I had finished, I had thought, you know, I sort of have a pretty good idea of this language, and I can give the homily and everything, and so in 1990, when I was going to return, I was leaving Brazil to come back to the Archdiocese of Detroit. I had this sort of despedida, like a going away mass with all the communities. There were a number of little communities in our parish boundaries. There were like 7 different chapels. One chapel, I should say, was the Matrice, the mother church, but then all the other. So they have this gathering, and we have mass, and it's saying goodbye to Father, and Father says goodbye to the people, and so I cried a little bit, and then the people get up to make their comments. And I had worked with this one lady, Buzinia, for probably all 3 years there. She was a catechist and a wonderful lady, and so here I had thought I had done such a good job with the language, and Buzinia got up at the end and she said, Quando Padre Eduardo chegou aqui, when Father Edward came here, a gente entende quase nada que ele diz. We hardly understood a word that he said. And then she says, mais, which means but, and I'm thinking, but, she's going to say, but he's really improved, or, but what a wonderful, eloquent person he is now, or something, you know, positive. And she says, mais a gente se acostume, which means we got used to him. And I always treasure that, because I think that's what maybe happens in our life, you know. It isn't that we change so much, but people get used to us. And that's all God is always asking, just give me what you have. That's probably why one of my favorite Gospels to meditate on is the multiplication of the loaves and fish, when he takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish from the boy and uses it to make something wonderful happen, a memorable event, which is what I think our life is all about, just giving what we have. God understands what we have, but we're the only ones that can give it. And when we do, He can nourish beyond belief. So those years in Brazil, there are a lot of wonderful stories there, and the days were great. I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't miss something else. You miss your friends, or you miss... I tell you, one of the things I missed when I was there was fall and spring, because there are only 2 seasons there, winter and summer, and in the wintertime it rains a lot. But you miss the freshness of spring, or you miss the fragrance of fall. That was one thing I missed. When I came back, I went to St. Raphael's Church. That's where I was assigned, which was a church on the west side, where I hadn't been serving on the west side, and it took me back to my days of growing up. Working people, and they took me to places that I had never thought I would go to or wanted to go to tell you the truth. Like St. Raphael's had a festival, which was a big thing, and I'm thinking festivals. Well, I went to a meeting with the leaders of the festival, and they said, all you have to do, Father, is pray. They took me out to dinner, and they said, you just got to pray. We know what we're doing, and we'll be helping you and helping the parish as we always have. And so, did you ever know how hard it is to pray for good weather? I mean, when it rains, guess who gets blamed? And when it rains, guess who feels terrible? And yet, we had an experience there one year where it poured. I thought the festival was going to be a washout. It turned out to be one of the greatest festivals we ever had. Money-wise, they made money. In fact, I think they came close to clearing $100,000, which was very good for that parish. And God, besides, gave us a very special gift. I believe it was resiliency, to be stretched beyond what you think you can do, and God can still do great things. That was a great experience there. At St. Raphael's, the church had been a gymnasium that was supposed to be a temporary church, so it had a number of things about it which were not attractive in the sense of creating a nice environment for people to worship in, the colors and everything. And so they said, well, we should do something about it, and I tried to put together a committee, a beautification committee, and I asked this one man who was always very interested in everything that was going on. His name was Francis Schmidt. And I said, Francis, a longtime member of the parish, I think he might have been about 80. I said to him, Francis, would you chair a committee for the beautification of the church? Because the stewardship committee had enough to do. They didn't feel they could do this too. And so Francis says to me, you're not thinking of building a new church, are you? And I said, well, I'm not really thinking of anything at this point. I'm just thinking, I know we have to do something. And he said, let me think about it. So about a week later, when I met him, I said, well, Francis, what do you think? And he said, well, if you let me choose the committee members. I said, well, it sounds all right to me. And he said, I'm going to pick people who take care of their homes. And that seemed to make a lot of sense to me. You want somebody who takes care of what they're given. And so this committee was put together, and at first there were a number of really women in it mainly. There were a few men, but it was a wonderful committee. We'd get together, we studied the documents on renewal in the church, we studied the bishop's statements about architecture. We went out to see churches which had similar floor plans or buildings like ours and what they had done. And this committee was so wonderful. And one day, it was a Sunday afternoon, it was raining, and I know it was during the football season because I was just sitting down in our rectory there on Merriman, and the doorbell rang, and I thought, who's out in this kind of weather? So I went to the door, and there was this young guy who came to the door, and he said, Father, I just want to give you this towards the renovation of the church. And I said to him, well, you're a student, aren't you, in college? He said, yeah, I go to Lawrence Tech. I said, you can't be affording it to give anything. And he said, no, he said, I want to do it because I love our parish and I really want to do it. He was a guy about maybe 21 or 22 years old. And so I said to him, would you like to serve on the committee? Because you're in architecture at Lawrence Tech. And he said, oh, I'd be honored. afterwards, when I went back in the house and I opened the envelope, he had given like $300 towards this, and I thought, this young man really has a lot of love for this parish and spirit, and so I was so happy he was a member of that committee. So that committee did a marvelous job, and when they had all their plans drawn out, they had a man named Leonard Else talk to them about lighting and a number of things, and he was a designer. The cost of this was going to be about $1,300,000, and I'm thinking, $1,300,000 to renew this building. I thought, no, I don't know if the Archdiocese will ever go for that. And so the day came, and the committee, we went down to present it to the consultors and to Cardinal Maida, and I think there was like, I remember Harriet Batchick and Francis were part of this presentation. They showed pictures and everything else of what they hoped to do, the drawings, and somebody said when they were through, it's about time. And you know, I so admire the hard work of this community at St. Raphael's. They really did a great job, and I begin to appreciate too more and more the role of the pastor, to give direction, yes, to uncover the gifts that are there, the people that can do the jobs, and they were just super in that regard. I have a fondness for every place I've been, but that particular group of people I really admire in a special way. They have a beautiful center of worship. They've done a lot of work. And the sisters who had been in that parish, the sisters Franciscans from Sylvania, Ohio, one of their sisters did the design of the windows, and they did the beautiful mural of St. Raphael on the front of the church. And although we didn't have all the money maybe to make something, you know, a classic, I think the church in itself and the beauty of it and all the work that went into it is what makes it a beautiful place of worship. And they still have a group called the St. Raphael Angels that come in every Friday and clean and take care of the church, because they know it's a big job to do, and you can't depend just on one maintenance man to do those kind of things. They assume leadership in taking care of it, and they've taken care of the grounds too, and the singing there, I'm really so pleased with the way people participate there, because they love to praise God, and they do sing, and it's a wonderful community. All these wonderful things. And then, of course, when I retired, they sent me off with a wonderful pat on the back and hugs and kisses. And then, because I couldn't get into the clergy village, Dr. Bauer was there with his home in Hazel Park, and he said, you can live here with me. Everybody's gone. So I enjoyed a year at his home in Hazel Park, where I learned a lot from him on being always concerned with the homebound and with the sick, and he always cares for people, and very faithful about going to Mass every day, and which was all perfect for my life. I enjoyed being with him. When I had to have my hip replaced, I came over to see Father Worm, who had had the same kind of surgery. I came over to ask him what was involved, because I lived with Dr. Bauer, and our bedrooms were upstairs and the bathroom was upstairs, and we had to come down to eat. And he said, you know, this home might be a little bit easier for you. Why don't you come live here? And I said, well, just till I do my rehab And so I came here thanks to the invitation of Father Worm, and when I was ready to go, he said, "Why don't you stay here?" And I said, "Well, I'd rather go out and help in other parishes and wherever there are some needs." And he said, "Well, that's okay, you're good for the house." And so here I am. I'm still at St. James, which is now my home, and I do help in parishes throughout the diocese, which I also enjoy because it helps me to understand the wonderful things that our priests and pastors are doing in all these different parishes. You know, it can be an overwhelming task, and yet every place that I've gone, I think the pastors there really try to do a great service to their people, and the people appreciate them. For the most part, they're just great. So it's a new glimpse of the church for me. And then I get a chance too, because many times during the week, if I'm not celebrating Mass here at St. James, I try to go to a Mass where another priest is celebrant, and I learn from them. I learn different insights into the Word of the Lord and see how it's affected other people's lives. And so it's a wonder. The senior priest status is still as beautiful and exciting as pastoring. And being a minister of the sacraments, a celebration of God's presence in the world that we live in. I think what happens is that, like, as sometimes something seems so routine, like the being a minister of the Holy Eucharist. And I really think it's such a great gift to be a minister of the sacrament, because when I'm giving communion to someone, their faith in God is what's nourishing me at the same time. We as ministers of the Eucharist stand up and say the body of Christ to a person, and they say amen. And this is what they believe. That it shows in their face, in their eyes, and in their hands in many ways. And so when they're confessing their faith in God who is with them, they're nourishing my faith as a minister of this sacrament. I mean, I see their faith in God, that God is real. And so I'm nourished. I realize better who I am. Same thing that happens in reconciliation. When a person comes in to confess their sins, my best experience of this, or I came to appreciate it maybe a little bit more, was when I was in Lourdes, and when I turned 75, and I went there to hear confessions for 3 weeks. And I went there with the idea that these wonderful penitents that would come in would be like my retreat masters. They would be confessing their sins, but they would really be confessing their faith in God who's in their life, and their trust in God. That's why they confess who they are. And in confessing who they are, they're saying that I'm a believer in God. And to be nourished by that kind of faith as the celebrant of this sacrament just helps my faith in God. Especially when somebody comes with, it's almost like they're so brave and saying things that they wouldn't say to anybody else because of God. I'm nourished by their faith. And the same thing happens in all the sacraments when you think about them, you know. I mean, when you see a husband and wife married for a long time, and you know what kind of life they've lived together, there's always sorrows and pain too, as well as the joys. But their faith is so precious. And this nourishes my vocation, that I need to be the same in my commitment to God's people and to God all these sacraments are such great gifts that not only allow us to nourish others, but to be nourished by the faith of the people that we celebrate these sacraments with. So that's at least the way I see God working in our lives. We're called to give, but in giving we receive. It's an amazing, only a divine mind could figure this out. It's almost like figuring out how can the cross, the sign of crucifixion, be a sign of resurrection, of new life, you know? That's what's going on all the time, I think. This mystery of giving. That's why I think it's somewhere in the scriptures where Jesus says, you know, if you sow sparingly, you're going to reap sparingly. If you sow generously, you're going to reap generously. God is always trying to give us himself so that we can make this journey with him. And the very people we're called to serve are the ones who are giving us their faith and their love for God. And that's what's nourishing us as priests, ministers, pastors, whatever we're called to be in life. His children, God's children. Dad, my grandpa, when he finally finished his days at Salve, which was in Del Rey, he would go around and pick up things. I mean, it was Depression time, and I know my uncles would be so embarrassed that Grandpa was going out and picking up stuff in the alleys at that time, you know, with his little wagon, and they'd say, "Pa, we give you the money." And that had nothing to do with it. It was just in him. He wanted to do it. And I think there's probably a little bit of my grandpa in me with this too, because, you know, when I see a paper clip on the floor, I'm thinking, God, that's still valuable. Or a rubber band, you know, we got a whole drawer full of rubber bands, which, but we used to save everything. So when I walk on the streets, I try to take a walk. Now during my time in the priesthood, I always tried to exercise a little, but there wasn't a lot of time to really be disciplined. That's what I always admired about Father Hayes, that he was really a disciplined man, that he took his walk every day or almost every day, and that was a part of his life. And he went to bed by a certain time, and he ate pretty much the same kind of breakfast every day. Well, now that I'm in my senior priest status, I can take a walk every day, and I try to do this for at least an hour or 6 rosaries. I sort of make it a spiritual, physical exercise. And as I walk along, I mean, if I see a penny, and it amazes me how just the other day I was walking along and I'm thinking, gosh, I have all these things that I'm supposed to do. I'm thinking of an invocation I'm supposed to give at a Memorial Day service and a homily, and I look down, and it's not like I'm looking all over the place for these, but I look down, and there, right on the sidewalk on Woodward Avenue, are 3 pennies. And I always just think, you know, God, you're just saying to me, I'm worth 2 cents or I'm worth 3 cents, so don't worry, I'll take care of you. You know, it becomes a prayer, just another way of coming in touch with a God who is always with us. So I enjoy those kind of things. When they happen, I'm grateful. And then for somebody to throw away a can that's worth 10 cents or a bottle, after being in Brazil, where you could buy a little loaf of French bread for 8 cents, and I see this bottle on the street, well, I'm going to pick it up. And I put it in the rack, and I know the housekeeper takes it, and I have a box for anything that I've picked up, like pennies or sometimes, you hit the jackpot. You even find a quarter sometimes. One time, I found a $20 bill after a rainstorm. I put it in this box, and that goes to the St. Vincent de Paul. It's no big deal. I don't think the St. Vincent de Paul is getting all the funds they need from this, but, these kind of things are just, everything is a gift from God, no matter how big, how small. The love of a child is a gift from God. The smile of a child is a gift from God. To see a couple holding hands and caring for one another is a gift from God. To find a husband and wife married into their 50s and because of your own experience that they've gone through a lot, it's a gift from God to meet these people. And so you treasure them. They're precious in God's eyes, and they're meant to enrich us. That's the way I look at these kind of things. Amen.